Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And again, we're speaking with Reverend Ian Smith. He's an Executive Officer for the Victorian Council of Churches. Ian, thanks for coming back. And last week, we finished off with talking about the Victorian Council of Churches. It was pretty truncated, so now we're going to explore that.
Mm-hmm.
It's 1948, is that the sort of time when that originated?
It's one of those moments where it's one of those real milestones in the life of the church. It's probably one of the less well-known stories that there were two significant events. 1911, there was a very big conference in Edinburgh in England or in Scotland, and the major Protestant churches all got together. Now, it doesn't sound very unusual today, but at the time, it was radically different. It was the first time in about 300 years that the church had actually talked to itself. And so that began a process, and then in 1948, post-Second World War, the World Council of Churches grew. And it began by this idea that the church is actually all the brands in the one space. And so just after 48, in Victoria, they formed the World Council of Churches Committee, Victorian Branch Committee. And Baptist Church of Christ, Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Salvation Army were some of the initial people who signed up and said, we want to explore what it looks like to be church together rather than church in opposition.
Yeah.
And so, and then it's grown along from that. The council was formally instituted as the Victorian Council of Churches in the late 50s. In 71, following Vatican II, where there was a recognition that the Roman Catholic community and what was the Protestant community, which used to be called the Protestant, but the Protestants actually softened it to be Protestant by changing the vowel structure. Though the recognition was that these were church together. Yeah. And so in 71, the Roman Catholics were invited into the council. And so today we have 29 member churches in the council. 13 of them are from our eastern community.
Oh, okay.
So Armenian, Romanian, Greek, Russian, Assyrian, Syrian, Chaldean, or Chalcedean, depending on which school you go to, Coptic, Martoma, Malankarans. And that's a recognition that in 1150 or thereabouts, the whole separation of East and West, and where you're going to go with the Julian calendar or did you go with the Gregorian calendar? Did you stay with the Syriac form of the liturgy, or did you go to the Roman form or the Western form of the liturgy, as we call it?
Right.
And so there's a sense in which the council now lives in this world where, in lots of ways, we embrace 2,000 years of history.
Yes.
So when we gather and we talk, we are bridging some of the greatest hurdles of the church. And so there are moments when the church is actually the big church, and something like the Nicene Creed, where we begin by saying, we end the creed by saying, there is one holy apostolic Catholic church.
Yeah.
We actually see that in practice, whereas often in practice you see all the brands like, items on a supermarket shopping shelf that are all competing for the same market.
The important thing being it's small c Catholic.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's quite remarkable, isn't it, bringing all of them together? And that sounds very idealised. How do they actually function?
Well, initially it was around what we call conciliation or concilia. So that meant it was very much about churches telling their story. And so It was by delegation, it was formal, it was fairly structured. It was a case of churches saying, we're legitimate because here's our story. This is apostolic, this is continual with your story and your story and your story around the table.
Right.
What's happened, and so that served the church really well for probably 3 decades, because there was a lot of gaps in people's stories. So if you were Catholic and you'd been formed at a time when there was great hostility between Protestant and Catholic, to suddenly sit at the same table, there was a gap in the story.
Yes.
And so for Protestants to listen to the Catholic story, you know, and to begin to non-demonise as a default, or for Catholics to actually hear Protestant stories without thinking these people are the infidels, these are the people who ruined the church because they watered it down, walked away. So the conciliar model was really important to begin. It was a place where trust and the narrative could begin to be focused. And so from 71 until probably the late 90s, early 2000s maybe, that model worked really, really well. But what happens in that model is that eventually you get to the place where you know each other, you're really comfortable with each other. And then the question is, what do you do with it?
Yes. Yep.
You know, do we all stay in our own little conciliar model and we just say, well, I'm okay as Church of Christ and you're okay as a Catholic and you're okay as a Baptist and you're okay as, or is there something more? And one of the tensions in the Christian church is that there is a tension between the local expression of faith and the global experience of faith. And so in the teachings of Jesus, you know, you get this really powerful story in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prays for his church. And he prays that they may be one, that the world may believe that God and Jesus are real. And the implication is, if the church isn't one, right, then the world will struggle to understand the truth in the message.
Exactly.
Now you can see that, and for 2,000 years the church has struggled with that. Now we live in the tension between the prayer of Jesus, the ideal prayer of Jesus, where there is one church with a capital C and everybody lives in harmony. And the tension you hear in the New Testament when Paul begins to write to his different, you know, the new churches, and you get Paul's writing and you get Peter and you get some of the anonymous guys who begin to struggle with that.
And they struggle the same as we're struggling with time. We'll go to a break, we'll be back. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Reverend Ian Smith. We interrupted you there, Ian. Continue on.
I was talking before about the tension in the church between the ideal, this sense of there is one church, capital C, everybody together, and who we are as people. And there's a story only 30 years after Jesus where one of the leaders of the church, Paul, writes to one of the church in Greece called Corinth and says, and basically the issue is, who are you following? You know, do you follow Peter? Do you follow Paul? Do you follow Apollos? Or do you follow Jesus? And so from very early on, the church lives in this tension between the ideal and the brokenness.
Yes.
And so the council sits primarily in the space of how do we hold that ideal of the church, one story, but we live with the brokenness that we all do things slightly different, we think slightly differently, we interpret slightly different. So we live in the tension. So the council came into being primarily to enable the church to hold those two things together.
Right.
And then to work. And so your question was, how do we work together? So we hold these two. Over the years, the council has developed a model which includes working groups where we invite the member churches to suggest people who might sit together long enough to, in their conversations and their discussions, find the common space that they all live in. So We have, Commission for Women, Commission on Social Justice, Commission on Living Faith, Commission on Faith and Order. And each of those have a function for the church. It enables the church to learn to listen to itself and talk to itself and hear. Now, one of the things that's grown out of that is that we now recognise that the church being church, it's about relationships. It's not about institutions so much.
Yeah.
And so the new way of being church now is to begin to reflect on what is the relational connections that bring us together, not stumble over the practical or the functional things that hold us apart.
Yes.
We'll never agree whether it's consubstantiation, transubstantiation or mere memorial when we break bread in the church, right? And for those people out there who don't understand, that's just a theological conversation, right? We'll never agree with whether ministers are over and above or from within.
Yes.
They're people. Those are functional things the church will always struggle with. But there is a greater story, which is the story that Jesus came to say God is love, and he invites people into a loving relationship with all people.
Yeah.
And that in that expression of love, how do we live that out? And so within the council, one of the functions of the council is to enable the churches to actually begin to live in that space and work in that space and hear what God is doing and begin to celebrate. And so one of the things we say is the council is a place of pilgrimage for churches trying to live out the call of Christ in the world, in its midst.
Yeah.
And so that's what we do. So we do that through 4 functions. And one function is creating that place of dialogue, so through those groups I just mentioned, where we invite the church to be, and one of my roles is to be a facilitator in that space. So a lot of my time I travel.
Yes.
Yesterday, on the Sunday, I was with a group of young, vibrant, under 35s who were exploring what does it mean to do church postmodernly. And so we gathered on the banks of the Mary Creek and we walked a labyrinth. Now, the labyrinth is a very, very, very old spiritual discipline, probably 2,500 years old, predates Christianity. But it's one of those practices that you can adapt.
Yeah.
And so if you walk through Europe, a lot of the middle-aged churches in Europe have labyrinths on the floor up the front near the altar, near the low altar. Yeah. If you go to Eastern Orthodox communities, you'll find them in Cyprus, you'll find them through Lebanon, Palestine and other places. So yesterday morning, I walked a labyrinth with this group of young postmodern. This coming Thursday, I will gather with our Armenian community, the first non-Jewish/Palestinian people in the world to convert to Christianity. So within 100 years of Jesus, here's a country who's become Christian. Now, I'll sit with them in their formality of 2,000 years of liturgy and sit with them as they recognise the martyrdom and the massacre and for some people the genocide of 1915. Now, that's my world, and but that's the breadth of the council. That's what the council. That's the role of council, to sit and to actually recognise where God is in all these different, from high liturgy and ancient practices through to the most existential current moment.
I can see why you took on the job, because it sounds very easy to me. It's just a piece of cake.
Oh yeah.
Now, do you do this? Do you have a committee that works with you? Yeah. So you'd need help to do it.
So the council is, in a functional sense, the council is made up of the 29 member churches, each of whom has 6 delegates. Thereabouts. A few of the larger churches have larger delegates. It makes up about 108 basically in the council itself.
Right.
Out of that council we have a leadership of 12, 7 elected, 4 co-options and some treasurer, secretary, etc. President. The leadership group must represent at least 5 denominations. And so there's a richness in that. Yes. And so the council has this layering, if you like. So the work of the council happens often in the working groups,
Yes.
Commission for Women, Commission for Environment, or the other things we do. And then we have these, then we have this gathering. We have a newsletter. So there's a range of things how we operate.
Right.
It's not all me. There's a whole lot of other people.
Well, I'm sure you're fairly grateful for that because
Yes.
But it's so encouraging. What was it, 1911, that this whole thing started to get its wheels on. Now, talking about 1911, that's some time ago. It's a long time ago, so we're out of time. But we'll be back. We'll be back in a moment.
Mani Allah, Alleluia, Mani Allah.
Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Reverend Ian Smith. Before the break, you were talking about the 4 key points. The second one is the peak body that the government refers to.
One of the things that the council performs, one of the roles the council performs, is that it's the spot between the diversity of church and the government. And so if the government want to talk to the church about social policy or about implications of anything they're doing, it is often very difficult for them to know where are the points of access.
Yes.
And so the council plays the role of being the point of access. So the Victorian Multicultural Commission, the Social Policy Division of governments on both, of all parties and persuasions, will often speak to the council on the basis of who are the most appropriate people to talk to, are there people to. And so just currently, for instance, the council was able to collect from its members advice about the impact of a particular piece of legislation that was going to be put to Parliament.
Okay.
And the parties were interested in what was the social and commercial and maybe the well-being of the society. How might it be impacted if this piece of legislation? And so they contacted the council and we disseminated it, got feedback from our constituents, and then we gave that back to the government. And the government then used that as part of their way they form policy. So council operates at that level.
That's a significant input. Another area which and this is big stuff, this bit I think, is your involvement with interfaith. So you're taking the council, which has done a lot of really good work ecumenically, it's now moving into interfaith. What does the mechanism for that look like?
There are three levels the council operates on in interfaith. One is that the council itself is a foundation member of 2 organisations. One's called JCMA, Jewish Christian Muslim Association.
Yeah.
It's been running for about 15 years. And it is primarily the Abrahamic faith. So, being together and having a conversation around mutual respect, understanding, fostering of a deepening conversation. The second one is that the council works in a thing called the CCJ, which is the Council of Christians and Jews, which is primarily around about rebuilding some of the relationships. Particularly, the church has a long history of Semitism, and there needs to be some restoration from the church's point. It wasn't that long ago that in some of the liturgies around Easter there was a prayer of forgiveness for the Jews who massacred Jesus on the basis that the rest of us had nothing to do with it.
Yes.
And that's primarily around restoring some relationships. Then we have, that's one level. The second level we have is that we have a commission called Living Faith, which are members of our member churches who are in conversation not only with themselves but also with the other living faiths.
Okay.
And so, and that's around how do we do things collaboratively that's for the benefit of the whole community. So for instance, they're exploring the whole thing of working in schools around having people of different faiths share stories around how you can live in harmony.
Okay.
So we do that. The third level is that I sit on a thing called the Faith Communities Council of Victoria. which is made up of the 9 peak faith communities in Victoria. It grew out of what we talked about last week, which was the Parliament of World Religions.
Yep.
And it meets and we sit at the table. And so we've got the Baha'i, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, the Brahmin Kumaras, the Sikhs. I can never remember the 9th group. And so we collaborate at that level. And so that means that the council is in direct link to the other peak bodies.
Yes.
So, and we can then talk about things like the current conversation is around general religious education in schools versus special religious education in schools. And special religious education is taught by 8 of the main groups in the Faith Communities Council, right? Some of them do it catechetically, i.e. they're teaching the faith to their own people to make them better at Hindus or Buddhists or whatever, better informed. Some are doing it in a more general sense. Now, you know, one of the things in all the press at the moment is access ministries and whether or not it has a disproportional percentage of the population, if you like, and I'll be very careful what I say.
Yes.
So that's a conversation between special religious education. Does it have a purpose? Is it still in our pluralistic, multicultural, multi-religious society?
Right.
Is there still a place in our secular education system for SRI? Versus, ought we go to a GRE, which is a general religious education, which you see in Ottawa, you see it in the UK, you see it in a number of countries, which recognises the enormous value that faith brings to life and vitality and harmony and the core values of society in a way that gives the kids a really balanced understanding that one of the aspects that creates the community we live in is actually the significant faith stories of the elders who've shaped the journey thus far. Yeah. So that's one of the things we do, and we talk about that across all the different things. One of the other things we often do at Faith Communities Council is talk about the pressure or the tension the various groups are under. And so sometimes the more established communities, like the Council of Churches, we have skills and understanding that we can share in a gentle way with some of the others about how they might go about. So we can be educative sometimes.
And it sounds fantastic, Ian. Thank you so much, because the pressure of time is upon us. Thanks for bringing the Victorian Council of Churches story, because it's a great story. And hopefully we'll interview again sometime.
It'd be my pleasure. And thank you for having me.
You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. Join us next week and we'll have another interesting interview. Bye for now.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.